A single rookie, recovering from injury, missing games, still learning how professional defenses operate, and she moved more than a quarter of the entire WNBA's economic output for the season, $36 million. That number alone should stop you cold. But here's the thing, that number isn't even the real story. The real story is what Nike saw in that number, what they documented on camera, and what they buried so deep inside a commercial that almost nobody caught it. Today we're going to pull that thread all the way to the end, because once you see the architecture underneath what Nike actually built, the entire future of women's sports snaps into focus in a way that's impossible to unsee. This wasn't a commercial about basketball. It was a business announcement dressed as a hype video, and the spring 2026 shoe launch that most people are treating as just another sneaker drop is something far more significant than anyone is publicly acknowledging. Stick with this, because every section of this story builds on the last one, and the final piece is the part that changes everything. Nike made a very specific choice when they decided to open that commercial with a driveway in Iowa, and it wasn't a sentimental one. When people see origin stories in athlete branding, they usually assume it's nostalgia, a soft moment designed to make you feel something before the highlight reel starts. That's not what this was. Nike opened with that driveway because everything about Caitlin Clark's competitive philosophy lives in what happened there. And once you understand it, you'll see it repeated in every business decision her name is now attached to. Here's what actually happened. The driveway where she learned to shoot was slanted, not slightly uneven, structurally slanted in a way that fundamentally changes how a developing shooter builds muscle memory. When you practice on a slanted surface, your ball trajectory shifts, your release point adjusts to compensate. Your body starts building habits around correcting for the flaw, rather than developing clean mechanics. Most kids would have worked with it. Most adults would have told their daughter to adapt. Her father poured new concrete. He built a regulation three-point line on a surface that could actually support what she was trying to develop. She wasn't asking for a luxury upgrade at age 4, she was demanding correct conditions. That distinction between adapting to a broken environment and refusing to accept the environment as a fixed variable is the operating thesis that Nike built this entire brand around. Think about what that means in practice. Every coach who looked at a young Caitlin Clark working from distances most players had never even attempted in a game situation had the same reaction. It won't translate. College defenses will neutralize that range. WNBA veterans will expose the shot selection. Film rooms across the country produced entire containment schemes designed specifically to solve one guard. Guard her at 28 feet and she drives past the coverage. Respect the drive and she pulls from the logo. The defensive math became impossible to solve, not because she was faster or stronger than every defender she faced, but because she had spent thousands of hours on that driveway building comfort from distances that most players had never genuinely practiced. The range wasn't a gimmick, it was a weapon, built from a specific decision made in childhood to eliminate a flaw rather than work around it. That pattern, doubt arrives, doubt is destroyed through execution rather than argument, is not incidental to the commercial Nike made. It is the structural blueprint of the commercial Nike made. The celebrities in that ad are not random talent selections. When you look at the specific framing of what they're doing in that commercial, expressing skepticism, voicing doubt, questioning whether what they're watching is real, you're watching Nike reconstruct every coach, analyst, and media voice that questioned whether her game would translate at each new level. The faces change, the function doesn't. Doubt presents itself, she responds with shots. No rebuttal, no argument, just results, delivered at a range that makes the doubt look absurd in retrospect. Standard athlete empowerment narratives do something similar on the surface, which is why casual viewers registered it as a clean hype video and moved on. But many people watching closely felt that something was different about it. That feeling was accurate. Nike wasn't documenting her shooting range, they were documenting a pattern, a repeatable, verifiable, data-backed pattern that they fully intend to replicate across every business decision they've tied to her name going forward. The commercial wasn't made for fans, it was made for sponsors, broadcast partners, and investors who needed to see proof of concept presented in a format that could live permanently in a pitch meeting. Because Nike didn't just film a commercial, they filmed a proof of concept document, and the proof came with receipts that nobody in the industry could argue with. Here's where the numbers get genuinely difficult to process. That $36 million economic impact figure isn't a projection, it isn't a marketing estimate or a number generated by a firm hired to make an investment look attractive. Economists tracked real transactions. Hotels in cities where the Indiana Fever played road games reported sellouts they had never previously seen for regular season WNBA games. Restaurants near arenas documented double their normal business volume on nights she was playing. Merchandise vendors hit numbers that had previously only appeared during playoff runs. Parking revenue spiked in markets that had never registered that kind of demand for a women's basketball game. And all of this happened while she was recovering from a groin injury, while she was missing games, while she was still in the process of learning how professional defenses operate at a level she had never faced before.
The full WNBA, 12 teams, hundreds of players, decades of institutional history, generated roughly $133 million in total economic impact that same season. One rookie accounted for more than a quarter of that figure. Not at full health, not across a complete season, just by existing in the league and being worth showing up for. That is a number that answers every question a corporate board can ask about risk. You cannot generate those kinds of transactions through marketing alone. You cannot manufacture that kind of verified economic movement with a good social media strategy or a well-timed press release. That is real money moving through real local economies because real people decided that watching her play was worth traveling for. Nike kept returning to that number internally, not because it was impressive in isolation, but because of what it represented at scale. If a rookie in year one, injured, still adjusting, generated a quarter of the league's entire economic footprint, what does year three look like? What does a full season at complete health produce? What happens when the shoe is in stores and the infrastructure around her brand is fully activated? Those are the questions that change the conversation inside Nike from "should we invest" to "how fast can we move without sacrificing the long-term build?" Before Nike had finished internally debating the timeline for her signature shoe, the television networks had already answered the most important question in sports media. Are the ratings real and are they sustainable? Within weeks of her WNBA debut, games featuring the Indiana Fever were drawing viewership numbers that rivaled NBA regular season matchups. Not WNBA averages, NBA averages. Advertisers who had never previously considered WNBA commercial inventory were suddenly competing for spots during her broadcasts. Networks that had treated women's basketball as a scheduling obligation were calling to renegotiate positioning. Streaming platforms reported engagement metrics the league had genuinely never measured before. Social media numbers moved in ways that the standard sports analytics frameworks weren't equipped to fully capture, because the audience growth was happening simultaneously across demographics that don't usually overlap. Young girls discovering basketball for the first time, alongside longtime sports fans who had never watched a WNBA game in their lives, alongside casual viewers who normally only tuned in for the biggest NBA nights. That kind of audience crossover is extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable to advertisers trying to reach multiple target groups with a single placement. And Nike watched all of it with the focused attention of an organization that already understood exactly what it was looking at. Because the television numbers weren't a surprise to them, they were a confirmation of data they had already begun building a franchise around before the season even started. The ratings weren't the evidence that convinced Nike to move. They were the evidence Nike needed to show everyone else that moving was the only rational choice. Nike CEO Elliott Hill confirmed something that wasn't in any press release when the partnership details began to surface. They're building this shoe with her, not for her. Logo decisions, design direction, distribution strategy, pricing philosophy. Caitlin influences all of it. That level of creative and strategic input is genuinely rare for any signature shoe partnership. But what made this particular revelation significant wasn't the collaboration itself. It was what she demanded when they got to the part of the conversation about how to sell it. She rejected the traditional signature shoe playbook entirely. No limited releases, no artificial scarcity, no collector pricing that puts the shoe out of reach for the exact kids who need it most. Think about what she was pushing against when she made that demand. The Jordan brand built a multi-billion-dollar empire on exclusivity, limited drops, waiting lists, secondary markets that treat shoes as investment instruments, with resale values that put them permanently out of reach for anyone who actually wants to play basketball in them. LeBron's line runs the same model: special editions, collector territory pricing, sneakerheads camping outside stores, resale markets treating release days as financial events. That playbook generates massive per-unit margins and cultural moments that dominate headlines for days. It is proven, it is profitable, and it was the obvious path for the most anticipated signature shoe launch in women's sports history. Nike's own board initially resisted her direction. The exclusivity model is reliable. The data on it is decades deep. Why abandon something that works when you could just apply it to a new audience and collect the margin? Then they ran the numbers she was actually proposing. Broader distribution means volume. Volume at accessible price points compensates for the reduced per-unit margin when you're selling to an audience that is genuinely enormous and largely untapped. Creating lifetime brand customers starting at age 8 in communities where women's basketball barely exists yet generates more long-term brand value than selling limited editions to collectors who never touch a court and whose loyalty to a product line is conditional on that product remaining exclusive.
Industry projections are already placing her line in top 5 signature franchise potential across all basketball categories, male or female. 9-figure revenue territory. That isn't the projection of a niche women's sports product. That is the trajectory of a mainstream global franchise built on the specific logic that accessibility at scale beats exclusivity at margin in a market that hasn't been fully opened yet. She also pushed for global distribution from day one, not as a test market, not as a future phase, not as an afterthought that gets addressed after the domestic launch is confirmed successful. From the beginning of the strategic conversation, Caitlin's position was that the shoe needed to launch internationally as a core element of the strategy, not a supplementary one. And the China angle in that commercial was not decorative. Nike operates massive manufacturing and retail infrastructure throughout Asia. The operational capacity to move product at scale in those markets already exists. What has almost never existed in those markets is demand for a women's basketball signature shoe that was built around a player those markets genuinely cared about following. Women's basketball signature shoes have historically failed to penetrate Asian markets in any meaningful way, not because the infrastructure wasn't there, and not because the audiences weren't interested in basketball, they very clearly are, but because the player hadn't arrived yet whose story crossed cultural boundaries the way necessary to generate that kind of demand organically. Her philosophy about distribution mirrors her philosophy about everything else she does on and off the court. Visibility without reach is just noise. A globally marketed shoe that isn't globally available isn't a global launch. It's a domestic launch with international marketing spend attached to it. She understood that distinction and refused to accept the version of this that left markets on the table because the traditional playbook said to move slow into new territory. The driveway logic applies here too. Don't adapt to the limitation, eliminate it.
Here is the business move that most people missed entirely when the spring 2026 launch timing was announced. Every marketing playbook in existence says you capitalize on momentum immediately. She wins Rookie of the Year, launch the shoe. Record viewership numbers hit in her debut season, launch the shoe. Pressure from retail partners wanting inventory, from investors wanting activation, from Nike's own internal teams pointing at the cultural moment happening in real time. All of it pointed toward an immediate release, while her name was dominating headlines and her story was being told everywhere simultaneously. Instead, they chose spring 2026, 18 months after her WNBA debut. That delay is the most telling signal in this entire story, and almost no one addressed it seriously. Nike spent years studying Michael Jordan's trajectory before launching Air Jordan 1. The timing of that release wasn't about Jordan being ready. Jordan was ready. It was about the narrative infrastructure being prepared to support a franchise, not just a shoe. LeBron's first signature shoe followed identical logic. Nike had spent years before that release building him as a generational figure through deliberate narrative construction. The shoe arrived after the story had already been told long enough to become undeniable. Every signature shoe that became a cultural franchise rather than just a product launch followed that same pattern. Timing mattered more than the hype cycle. Caitlin's delay follows that logic exactly. Her rookie season proved the concept, but one season proves a concept. It doesn't confirm a franchise. Her second season, the one where defenses arrived with a full off-season of film study, where the novelty factor had time to fade, where the question was no longer whether she was exciting, but whether the impact was sustainable. That season provides the confirmation Nike needs before committing to a multi-year global activation, because by spring 2026, 2 full seasons of verified economic data exist. Television ratings tracked across multiple years rather than isolated spikes, audience growth documented through sustained metrics, a sophomore season that either proved her impact doesn't disappear when defenses adjust, or would have forced Nike to recalibrate. The fact that the launch remained on schedule tells you exactly what that sophomore season delivered. That's not a shoe launch, that's a franchise activation on prepared ground. The difference in long-term performance between those two things is not marginal, it's the entire ballgame. Here's what makes the commercial itself genuinely impressive from a strategic standpoint. It was engineered to communicate 2 entirely different messages to 2 entirely different audiences simultaneously, and almost no one noticed the second message because the first message was executed well enough to fully satisfy casual viewers.
Casual fans see a clean, hype video. Great shots, celebrity cameos, an origin story with emotional pull. Standard athlete empowerment content delivered at a high production level. That's a satisfying watch. You share it, you feel good about the athlete, you might buy a ticket to a game. That layer of the commercial does exactly what a surface-level read expects it to do. But anyone who spends serious time studying how women's sports economics work, sponsors evaluating whether a media buy makes sense, broadcast partners deciding whether to increase their investment in WNBA inventory, international retail partners deciding whether to prioritize shelf space for a women's basketball product, those audiences saw something entirely different playing out in the same 2.5 minutes. They saw proof of audience, real viewership data framed as a cultural narrative. They saw proof of sustained demand, 2 seasons of economic impact packaged as an origin story. They saw a roadmap, pricing strategy, distribution philosophy, and timeline framing all embedded in what looked from the outside like brand storytelling. Nike didn't stand in front of a boardroom and argue that women's basketball deserves investment because it's culturally important or because the athletes have worked hard enough to earn it. They made a commercial that showed the receipts and let the math do the talking. That approach, results over rhetoric, execution over argument, mirrors the subject of the commercial down to the smallest detail. It was deliberately constructed that way. Caitlin Clark's journey from a slanted driveway in Iowa isn't just a compelling origin story, it's the operating framework for the most strategically patient brand build in women's sports history.
and every element of what Nike has constructed around her name follows the internal logic of that framework with a consistency that is genuinely unusual in an industry that normally sacrifices long-term positioning for short-term momentum. The $36 million wasn't a ceiling, it was the foundation measurement, a baseline taken in the most imperfect possible conditions: injured athlete, incomplete season, defenses still in their first year of studying her, so that everything that comes after has a verified starting point to be measured against. The accessible shoe pricing isn't a margin sacrifice, it's a market expansion play targeting a global audience of potential lifetime customers in demographics and geographies that the exclusivity model never reached and never could have reached. The delayed launch timing isn't hesitation, it's positioning, ensuring that when the franchise activates, it activates on confirmed ground rather than projected ground. Women's basketball is entering territory that was previously considered exclusively reserved for men's sports. Global branding with genuine international infrastructure behind it. Franchise-level signature shoe lines with 9-figure revenue projections. Billion-dollar cultural footprints that reshape how entire leagues are valued by broadcasters and sponsors. And Nike has now told us, with unusual specificity and through a commercial most people watched and immediately moved past, exactly when they're moving and exactly how they intend to get there. The shoe drops in spring 2026, but the real question, the one that will determine whether this becomes the most significant moment in women's sports business history, or just a very impressive launch, is whether the WNBA's infrastructure can support the commercial wave Nike is building toward. The league grew dramatically alongside her first 2 seasons. The broadcast deals improved, the attendance numbers moved, the media coverage expanded. But a Nike franchise activation at the scale they're planning will stress test every part of that infrastructure simultaneously. Arenas, broadcast capacity, merchandise supply chains, international licensing frameworks, all of it will face pressure it has never faced before at the same time. That's the next piece of this story, and it's the one that determines whether the foundation holds or whether the wave Nike is building ends up bigger than the structure built to receive it. Don't miss it when it drops.